Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Reed Sherman, and I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I wanted to draw your attention to a note in the chat box. Audio is disabled for all participants, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them in the chat box. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Eliza Lustig, who is our technical support person today. Please also note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards others per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. Next slide, please. I'll kick off our webinar today with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the Southern Great Plains chapter authors. The U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes, and this is actually breaking news now today, 15 agencies rather than the 14 whose seals are shown here, because just today it was announced that the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, has joined USGCRP. So that's news to everyone on this call. So the program convenes 15 agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. The same law that established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or the NCA. The NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and informal and informal education. NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, examine the confidence in our scientific understanding, and evaluate uncertainties. NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive and does not advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, the report process involves extensive review, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government science reviews. Now let's take a look at the NCA5 table of contents. Like previous national climate assessments, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. The report opens with an overview, which is followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. Then there are the national topic chapters, the 10 regional chapters, and 2 response chapters, although I'll note that response actions are also discussed throughout the report, including in the chapter that we're discussing today, the Southern Great Plains. The NCA table of contents has evolved over time, informed by user input. NCA5 added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features. Those are on compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. And we have several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. Now that we've gone through some introductory background, it's my pleasure to introduce Renee McPherson, the chapter lead of the Southern Great Plains chapter, who will lead us through the remainder of the webinar today. Thanks, Renee.
Thanks, Reed, and good afternoon, everyone. We're going to now turn to the Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, and the tribes within the Southern Great Plains. Several members of our wonderful author team are here with me as speakers today. April Taylor, Ollie Fairs, Georgianne Moore, Tiana Bruno, and Darian Bertrand. And all of our team members are listed here. The Southern Great Plains has seen fewer large-scale impacts of climate change than other regions because of its relatively low latitude, flat terrain, and high climate variability. Still, annual average temperatures have increased 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit for Kansas and Texas, and 0.6 degrees for Oklahoma over the last century. Much of the warming has been during the winter. Annual precipitation has increased across most of the region, mostly from heavier summer rains. Some extreme events are becoming more frequent or intense. For example, the annual number of days with 2 or more inches of precipitation has increased, especially east of I-35. Future temperatures are expected to be historically unprecedented as early as the mid-century. We project more extremely hot days, fewer extremely cold days, and more intense drought conditions in the future. Slightly drier future conditions are expected across the southern and western parts of the region. More precipitation is projected near the region's northern and eastern boundaries, especially by the century's end. The changing climate conditions are expected to influence how we live, work, play, heal inequities, and serve residents. And our team focused our key messages around these themes. April will start us off with key message 1. April, you're muted.
Alyssa, it won't let me start my video.
All right, go ahead
Can
and
you hear?
yes, we can hear you now. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Renee, for the key message number 1. Climate change is starting to alter how we live, putting us at risk from climate hazards that degrade our lands and waters, quality of life, health and well-being, and cultural interconnectedness. Many hazards are projected to become more frequent, intense, or prolonged, or to expand in area. We expect more people to suffer from climate extremes and events. In the 1980s, the US had an average of $1 billion disaster every 4 months. Now there's an average of 1 every 3 weeks. In fact, from 2018 to 2022, $52 billion climate-related disasters affected somewhere in our region. Each additional increment of global warming is expected to cause more economic losses. Cities and towns are being harmed by air and water pollution, extreme heat, drought, and flooding. Coastal cities have additional risk from sea level rise. As shown on this map of Houston, the impacts of disasters can compound and amplify harm to at-risk populations. The yellow lines highlight areas that were most affected by Hurricane Harvey, the February 2021 cold outbreak, and COVID-19 unemployment. Most of these areas have high social vulnerability, where the gray shading is the darkest. But Houston is responding. It developed its Resilient Houston strategy and climate action plan in 2020 to prepare for, withstand, and recover from sudden catastrophic events and slow-moving disasters, including those worsened by climate change. Through the Indian Removal Act and treaties with the U.S., tribes became bound geographically to fixed areas. often where they were more exposed to climate hazards than their historical lands. As a result, indigenous traditions, heritage, and culture are at higher risk from climate change. For example, warming temperatures are shifting ranges of culturally significant species, making them absent or rare on lands where indigenous peoples have access. Tribes are reviving cultural practices and relationships with nature to find solutions that resonate with their traditions and worldviews. For example, the Tribal Alliance for Pollinators is building on indigenous cultural and medicinal traditions to preserve and restore grassland ecosystems for monarch butterflies and other threatened pollinators. Community food forests, such as the Osage Orchard in Pawhuska, Oklahoma, provide food sovereignty and security, climate resilience, and public health benefits. Warming temperatures are expanding the ranges and lengthening the active seasons of ticks, mosquitoes, and other disease vectors. For instance, ticks continue to seek hosts across eastern Kansas and Oklahoma in the winter of 2017, when temperatures were relatively warm. Warmer future temperatures are expected to expand the range of tropical diseases such as dengue, West Nile virus, and Chagas disease. And warmer and drier conditions across western parts of the region are projected to support an increased evidence of valley fever. High temperatures harm human health, especially when humidities are high. People who are male, Black, 65 years or older, diabetic, unmarried, without air conditioning, or living below the poverty line are at higher risk of heat-related death. Warmer temperatures worsen air pollution by increasing near-surface ozone. In 2023, for example, more than 12 people were at risk when 18 Texas counties exceeded national ozone standards. To address the growing risk, each of our key messages outlines an example climate driver, its impacts, and actions that people, organizations, or communities can take to be more climate resilient. For example, more frequent or severe droughts can cause drinking water shortages. Communities can prepare by replacing leaking pipes, implementing water reuse, and developing drought plans. Now I will turn it over to Allie for our next key message.
Ali, are you able to turn on your video and microphone?
Sorry, I didn't turn my, sorry. Okay, let me repeat. Key messages, 2 notes, how businesses and industries across the region are experiencing disruption and economic losses as a result of economic change. But we also highlight that there are new economic opportunities for those who look forward. Hotter temperatures, heavier precipitations, stronger tropical cyclones, and other climate changes have harmed workers' health and productivity, inflated production or building costs, and disrupted supply chains. Climate change-related damages to businesses have threatened the continuity of operation, increased insurance costs, disrupted supply chains, and shifted customer demand. Past climate extremes, such as the February 2021 cold outbreak, have exposed gaps in the resilience of business to climate change extremes, while also highlighting opportunities to develop products and services in response to worldwide demand for resilient solutions. The energy industry in the Southern Great Plains is a global leader in the fossil fuel exploration and production. It serves a large fraction of global energy demand and supports rural towns through local employment and tax revenues. Fossil fuels release heat-trapping gases to the atmosphere when burned, contributing substantially to atmospheric warming. In 2020, Texas led the nation in emissions of carbon dioxide and methane, two of the main heat-trapping gases. Throughout the US and the Southern Great Plains, there is a major shift in electricity generation from fossil fuels toward renewables, creating new jobs, cleaner air, and climate change mitigation benefits. Electricity generated from gas and coal is not expected to increase substantially in the region, whereas electricity generated from wind and solar are projected to increase substantially. In 2022, US producers in the 50th state generated 435 million megawatt hours of electricity from wind power. Of that, Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas contributed 40% of total US production. Major wind installation in rural communities support the local tax base, stabilizing funding for public services such as education, road maintenance, emergency services, as well as infrastructure such as hospitals, jails, and parks. This energy transition serves to mitigate future emission of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, but past climate extremes also have demonstrated gaps in the resilience of our current energy infrastructure. For example, a severe cold outbreak in February 2021 led to extensive outages for electricity generating plants serving the Electricity Reliability Council of Texas, or ERCOT. The map here shows the power reductions by fuel type for electricity generation facilities serving ERCOT during the outbreak. Larger circles represented in the map represent larger energy outage values. In Texas alone, loss of generation capacity caused more than 4.5 million customers to be without power at some times during the cold outbreak. Next slide. Go back to that slide. By certain population were disproportionately affected. For example, the graph shows here on the right-hand corner of the graph the power outages during this cold outbreak based on income level and race and ethnicity. So regardless of wealth status, data indicate that areas with highest population of non-white people were the most likely to be impacted by power outages. White scale outages were avoidable, However, the city of El Paso, Texas, had prepared for extreme cold following widespread energy and water disruption in 2011. They were more prepared and they didn't show the same outages. The city invested in winterization of power infrastructure and built a new power plant that could operate with different fuel types. These adaptations also with the city connecting to a different power grid result in a few outages during the 2021 event. Next slide, please. So agriculture producers are experiencing loss of livestock and crops, reduced income, and negative public health outcomes as climate change extremes increase in magnitude and frequencies. Warmer average temperature are leading to longer growing seasons, which affect different species differently and potentially disrupt the long-term natural connection between plants and their pollinators, or between insects and their predators. High temperatures have reduced plant growth, diminished crop productivity, and pose risk to animal health. Events that have hot, dry, and windy conditions have increased in the southwest Kansas, and the panhandle of Oklahoma and Texas. Wheat yields are reduced proportionally to the number of hot to dry, windy hours. Drought has reduced the capacity of native rangelands and planted pastures to support livestock. Historical plant hardiness zones are predicted to continue migrating northward as the average minimum winter temperature warms. Producers are expected to experience drier conditions and more frequent or intense drought by mid-century in western and southern parts of the region, lowering productivity of increasing irrigation costs, as we have experienced this summer. So in western Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas panhandles, the combination of cold fronts and early spring is predicted to increase, as you can see from these two figures, to increase the potential for bud burst before the late freeze. So you have flowering and then, not flowering, budding, and then the freeze comes and destroy those buds. These late fall spring events threaten crop production and also the viability of the crop itself. The risk of late fall spring is projected to increase up to 20% by the end of the century across most of Kansas, Oklahoma, and northern Texas under an intermediate scenario, and across a smaller portion of the northern under a very high scenario. Last slide here, please. Communities and businesses can work together to reduce the risk from extreme heavy rainfall events, as these extreme events flood facilities, inundate croplands, interrupt businesses, or disrupt transportation. Managers and planners can take both incremental and transformative actions to improve business outcome and reduce losses. We also see opportunities for businesses and industries to develop products and services that will help managers adapt to climate change and the need to reduce emissions on a worldwide scale present economic opportunities for energy-related businesses in the region to pilot and develop new technologies. Georgianne will now discuss our next theme.
Key message 3 focuses on how climate extremes are affecting our participation in outdoor sports, recreation, and leisure activities. Historically underserved populations are disproportionately harmed by climate change impacts, reducing their participation in and health benefits from outdoor physical activities. However, adaptations can be made to reduce climate risk and increase positive health outcomes for all people. People of all ages have decreased athletic performance, do less outdoor activity, and are at high risk of dangerous health issues because of extreme heat, air pollution, heavy rains, and other weather hazards. Risks are high for older adults and those with chronic disease or higher body mass index, as well as those exposed to climate extremes for a long period, such as long-distance runners. Changing climate extremes have jeopardized recreation by damaging facilities. With warming temperatures, hunters are expected to see shifts in wildlife habitats and ranges and decreases in the size and weight of prey. Extreme heat is the most likely and dangerous threat to outdoor activities in the future. Heat injuries can damage organs or disrupt the central nervous system. Heat stress can occur at temperatures of 80 to 85 degrees, where play areas are unshaded and have artificial surfaces. Heat risks apply to any outdoor sport. Nationally, heat-related illnesses are the third highest cause of death among high school athletes and are the most preventable cause of death in youth sports. Future increases in the number of very hot days and warm nights are expected to worsen health concerns. By the end of the century, under a very high scenario, the number of 100-degree days is projected to increase by 30 to 60 days across Kansas and Oklahoma, and by more than 80 days in parts of southwestern Texas. Lakes, streams, and reservoirs supporting fishing, hunting, and other outdoor recreation can be affected. However, more variable or heavier rainfall, droughts, and higher temperatures have jeopardized recreation. In 2019, for example, southeast Kansas and northeast Oklahoma experienced historic spring flooding after nearly 2 feet of rain fell. The Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism sustained more than $12 million in damages, mostly through lost revenues from park closures. Along the Texas coast, recreational opportunities are expected to change as coastal ecosystems transform from sea level rise, warming temperatures, and more powerful or rainier tropical cyclones. Individuals, communities, and sports organizations can adapt to these hazards through strategies such as modifying the timing, location, intensity, or monitoring of activities. The example adaptation and mitigation actions here can increase resilience and reduce negative impacts resulting from extreme heat. Communities can support local sports, leisure, and recreation by sheltering people from extreme heat through shaded green spaces, splash pads, and other park amenities that cool people. Now, Tiana will highlight key message 4.
Thank you so much, Georgianne. So this fourth key message documents how some people and places are suffering disproportionately from climate-related hazards because of historical marginalization or discrimination, as well as inadequate attention to equity in policymaking. Without significant attention to these inequities, climate change will worsen the burdens on those afforded only the fewest resources to prepare and adapt. As we look at mitigation and adaptation solutions, it is helpful to place an equity and justice lens on all decision-making. We can recognize that those who are most affected by climate change have values, cultures, and perspectives of their own that can be centered in our solutions. We can ensure that benefits, negative consequences, and mitigations and adaptations are equitably distributed across all neighborhoods and communities. We can recruit and listen to people who have historically been sidelined or undervalued in policy and governance conversations, so that those at greatest risk help devise workable solutions. Research indicates that marginalized populations are more at risk of negative impacts of climate extremes and hazards. For example, Black communities nationwide are projected to bear a disproportionate share of future flood damages. Low-income communities and communities of color tend to only have access to housing that lacks adequate weatherization, air conditioning, and structural resistance to high winds. Many of these communities also do not offer or do not have adequate tree canopy, shade, or green spaces to provide relief during extreme heat. Low-income residents and residents of color are more likely to live in flood-prone areas or to live near chemical facilities that can expose them to toxins during and after an extreme weather event, such as a hurricane, severe winds, or flash flood. For example, along the Texas Gulf Coast, many residential neighborhoods with high proportions of Black and Hispanic residents are located next to petrochemical facilities that were flooded during and after Hurricane Harvey made landfall in 2017. The event exposed residents to contaminated waters and polluted airs. With climate change projected to intensify hurricanes and bring heavier rainfall, the risks to these communities are even higher than places further away from these hazardous facilities. After a disaster, many people who are poor, uninsured, and without access to climate recovery and adaptation programs have not rebuilt. Some of the people at greatest risk of impacts are working hard to build resilient and thriving communities in the face of climate change. For example, across the Southern Great Plains, many Indigenous tribes are applying their traditional knowledges and experiences to develop their own climate action plans for both historical, ancestral, and relocated lands. Our institutions and governments can play a role in improving outcomes for these peoples and places by incorporating justice and equity principles and climate resilience strategies and actions. Using an equity and justice lens on all projects, we can reduce risks and build resilience where we know people will be disproportionately affected by climate change. Darian will now discuss our last key message.
Thanks, Tiana. Key message 5 focuses on the institutions that serve our communities. The efficiency, effectiveness, and equitable distribution of public services are being affected by more frequent and intense weather events. For example, extreme heat has reduced passenger and cargo loads for aircraft and buckled roadways and railways. Heavy rainfall has eroded rail, road, and bridge foundations, and coastal storms have interrupted shipping and caused mass evacuations. When systems fail, the impacts have been more devastating for people living in under-resourced neighborhoods. Without significant adaptation, we expect that climate change will strain public infrastructure and services in the decades to come. Public utilities depend on reliable, safe, and abundant water supplies. These sources are at risk from warmer air and warmer water temperatures, more frequent and severe drought, more intense rainfall events, and changes in rainfall frequency and timing. For example, soil contraction during an extended drought that started in 2011 caused damage to infrastructure across Texas, resulting in a substantial increase in boil water notices and sanitary sewer overflows. With more severe droughts comes the risk of larger wildfires. From 2000 to 2018, firefighters in the Southern Great Plains fought 16 megafires. These are fires larger than 100,000 acres that overwhelm local response capacity and are extinguished only when weather conditions become favorable to use. Climate change literacy is important to engaging the public and policymakers in solutions. However, educators rarely receive formal education on the subject, leading many K-12 science teachers to have misconceptions and critical gaps in climate change knowledge. In addition, as of 2022, only Kansas fully incorporated human-caused climate change in its K-12 state curriculum standards. Climate change information is expected to be blended into state water and transportation plans to reduce future risks. Kansas and Oklahoma have considered climate change and its risks in their statewide water plans. Only Kansas's transportation plan includes threats to infrastructure from extreme weather. However, many aspects of climate change remain missing. Although many state agencies are not broadly engaged in the conversation about climate change, many organizations, tribes, and communities are acting in response to the overwhelming scientific evidence for climate change and its increasing impacts. For example, in 2020, Oklahoma City produced its first sustainability plan, AdaptOKC, which addressed climate change. Austin, San Antonio, and Dallas also adopted plans that included both mitigation and adaptation actions. And these cities have also started addressing local equity issues as related to climate change impacts. Smaller communities that lack resources for standalone climate plans are integrating actions into hazard mitigation or comprehensive plans for their community development. Departments within cities and tribes are also taking action. For example, the Public Utility Division of the City of Norman, Oklahoma has started to operate facilities using renewable energy. They also began to supplement water supplies during drought by transferring reclaimed water to the nearby reservoir for future use. Here we also provide some example actions that can enhance our community resilience. However, planning and implementation cannot occur piecemeal by solving one issue at a time. Agencies and organizations can collaborate to consider the whole public service system and how climate change is projected to affect its different elements.
Thanks. So we'll end by saying that the scale, scope, and pace of climate mitigation and adaptation throughout the Southern Great Plains has been too small for us to be resilient to what we expect in future decades. Actions will need to be transformative and use an equity and justice lens to ensure that we don't leave our most under-resourced communities behind. Investments in systemic planning and implementation are expected to pay off in the future by reducing the costs and disruptions that otherwise will occur during extreme events. So I wanted to also thank the incredible author team of the Southern Great Plains chapter, and to all who contributed through all the public engagement processes and reviews, and thank our speakers today. And thanks to all of you for joining today. This concludes sort of the presentation part. We'll now be turning off the recording.